With 4 days until the U.S. election, Donald Trump is escalating the violent rhetoric he's been using to target his political opponents. Just last night, he said this about Liz Cheney, a high-level Republican who's endorsed Kamala Harris.
She's a radical war hawk. Let's put her with a rifle standing there with 9 barrels shooting at her, okay? Let's see how she feels about it. You know, when the guns are trained on her face.
Kamala Harris took the opportunity to criticize Trump for his comments while appealing to union workers in battleground Wisconsin today.
Imagine on January 20th, it's either that, him plotting over his enemies list, or me working for you on my to-do list. And at the top of my list is bringing down your cost of living, and it will be my focus every single day as president.
Nearly all major polls show Harris and Trump locked in a dead heat, both nationally and in all 7 battleground states. The poll tracker 538 took an aggregate of those polls. It has Harris at 48% and Trump at 46.8%. Elaine Godfrey is a staff writer covering national politics at The Atlantic, and Aaron Blake is a senior political reporter at The Washington Post. They're here to talk about the stretch run of this campaign. It's good to see you both. Thanks for being here. Appreciate it.
Thank you.
Look, I want to talk about the Liz Cheney comments in just a second. But Aaron, first, I just want to start with the overall state of the race. They're spending their final weekend trying to mobilize the voter bases in the battleground states. What's your sense of what you're seeing there and where these races are?
Yeah, I mean, it's no secret that we've had close elections in recent cycles. I think this is a little bit different even against that backdrop. We have 7 states that are going to decide the next president, and basically all of those 7 states, according to the Washington Post polling averages, are within 2 points. So you factor in the margins of error, and you could have anything from a Trump sweep of those states to a Harris sweep of those states, even if you just shift the polls a little bit. And so we really have no idea what's going to happen. It is that close. It's that competitive. I think it's a pretty remarkable, you played some of the comments from Kamala Harris there, where she's talking about the contrast in the late messages from these 2 campaigns. Harris is running much more of a traditional kind of reach to the middle campaign that's focused on bread and butter issues like the economy. And you're seeing Trump with a very different focus. He's going after his base with a series of provocations, of stunts, comments like the ones we're going to talk about Liz Cheney. It's really just a contrast in how these 2 campaigns see the final stretch run of this campaign.
So let's get to those comments. Elaine, let's talk about this. Like in a Canadian election, if with 4 days left, if a candidate for prime minister said, basically put a firing squad on one of your critics, it's curtains. Like the whole thing is over. But as we know, nothing seems to hurt Donald Trump. What is your sense of how the closing week of the Trump campaign has affected things in the big picture?
Yeah, I mean, and I think we maybe a few years ago would have been able to say the same thing, that kind of rhetoric would kind of be the end of your campaign for president. The Trump era has certainly changed that. So yeah, I mean, I think that is a really bad move going into this final week. I mean, his rally in New York at Madison Square Garden, where people made racist jokes and comments, and the sort of message was much more, as Aaron said, of provocation rather than unity or reaching out to undecided voters. I think Kamala Harris's strategy, her closing argument, is reaching out to independents, moderates, Republicans, saying, "I'll be a president for you," which is much more traditional and which I think is probably much more effective among these voters who have yet to decide. And also, we heard a press conference today from the Harris campaign. They said that actually, according to their internal polls, which you can take with a grain of salt, this past week has seen a lot of these undecided voters leaning towards them. They have not enjoyed Trump's recent rhetoric, and that's really turned them off.
Right. So Aaron, on that, I didn't see that press conference, but I saw tweets from Matt Visor, who happens to work at the Washington Post, of all places, where I learned this. I mean, what do we make of it? It does seem like what you saw Sunday in Madison Square Gardens, without an apology, kind of a doubling down and then an escalation today, that if you are truly undecided, this could be a thing that helps you make up your mind one way or another. What do we make of the internal polls that they say they're citing?
Yeah, I mean, there is a tendency to look at these things and say that they don't hurt Donald Trump because He has remained politically viable through any number of other controversies, even racist comments in the past. But I think we need to also take a step back and realize that there are many people who don't pay attention to politics, back when Trump was indicted or convicted. They hadn't tuned into the campaign. And what they're being served up towards the end of this race is a steady diet of some of the kinds of things that people objected to when Trump was the president. The chaotic nature of things, causing controversy constantly. I think that Donald Trump is more popular right now than he was when he was ever president, at least beyond the early days of his presidency. And so you are in a situation where you are risking reminding people of the reasons why they didn't like you before. And so then it becomes a question of, well, if they remember those things, do they think that that's at least better than the alternative? And I think the Harris campaign is basically putting themselves forward as a traditional president who you can forget about for days at a time and not have to think about. And that seems to be kind of their closing strategy.
So, Elaine, the closing arguments are pretty clear. But what strikes me as really interesting is the gender-based electoral play between the two campaigns. With Kamala Harris obviously going for young women with a big emphasis on abortion and reproductive rights, this has proven to work in off-cycle elections and state-level elections in the United States. So there's a tried and true nature to that. Trump going after low-propensity white men, though, through Joe Rogan and everything, seems riskier. But that's the play he's making. Men who don't pay attention to politics, don't often vote. He's trying to get them to come out in a record number. That seems to be it.
Right. And I think it is a risky strategy. I mean, I think he's won before with low propensity voters. That was sort of his recipe for success in 2016. But he was a relatively unknown quantity in 2016. He has since become president, encouraged a riot at the U.S. Capitol, said all this stuff, reminded people in this vital week ahead of an election of the kind of president he was and will be. And I think that it's a risky strategy. I think Kamala Harris, a lot of this early vote has been women, and we don't want to, over extrapolate from any early data we're seeing. But women are, they tend to be sort of more bothered by a lot of these comments that Trump is making. He could have made a much better appeal to female voters in this final week. He could have, and I think that his campaign maybe tried to get him to, and he really just didn't do it, didn't make it happen.
So, Aaron, I wonder about that. In this attempt to reach, the young men through vehicles like the Joe Rogan podcast and other things they've done. J.D. Vance was on there yesterday and said some things that also generated headlines that I wonder how women voters feel about, right? Whether by reaching out to young men, if you are not in some ways inflaming and mobilizing young women in particular. I mean, what's your sense of how the two strategies intersect with each other here?
I mean, you've seen in recent days how conservative women who are sympathetic to the Trump campaign, have even endorsed the Trump campaign, have called this out as being a problem. We had Nikki Haley, who was Trump's primary opponent, who has since endorsed him but hasn't been a prominent figure on the campaign trail, come out and talk about how the Trump campaign is not doing enough to appeal to women. We've had Megyn Kelly, former Fox News host who now hosts a separate program, talking about how the campaign is a little bit too bro-y. She was talking about the rally at Madison Square Garden and the idea that there's just not much of an effort to reach out to women. The problem with Donald Trump is he's often viewing himself as his best campaign strategist, and he will do the things that he wants to do. So after Harris got in the race, you had a whole bunch of people saying that he needed to focus on policy rather than personal attacks on her, and he never really did that. Certainly, there is something to be said for bringing out the low propensity voters, male voters, that could work for him. But women are a larger portion of this electorate, and the losses that the Republican Party has sustained among especially white suburban women since Roe v. Wade was overturned in 2022 are a big problem for the campaign.
Yeah, and Elaine, I know you say none of us can really draw conclusions from the early voting anymore because of just the way that's evolved and become easier, and the emphasis on campaigns, and the COVID election is a real outlier in terms of comparing things. But we have seen women show up in big numbers, Though this week we have the Puerto Rico insults, which it's unclear how that's going to affect things like in Pennsylvania, but Trump in Dearborn today going after Arab Americans to reach out to their discontent over the Biden administration's handling of the Israel-Hamas and other conflicts. What's your sense of how those particular specific issues could be affecting things in the stretch run?
Yeah, I mean, it's so hard to predict, especially, in a state like Michigan where Trump is today, where both campaigns have spent a lot of time this week actually, trying to shore up that vote. I think Trump is trying to sort of persuade some of these Arab Americans who are really frustrated with Joe Biden's administration and therefore Kamala Harris about this handling of Israel and Gaza. He's trying to sort of, shore that up for himself, get some of those folks on his side. I don't know, sort of, I think in the end, a lot of the data around that is maybe overblown. I think a lot of the voters in Michigan, may come around in the end, faced with a choice between Trump and Harris. I really do think, though, in Michigan and elsewhere, I mean, for Harris, it really is a contest between, getting her voters to the polls, or staying on the couch, right? Like it is a
Right.
contest between Kamala and the couch for so many people.
No, it's a good way to describe it because, Aaron, when you look at Trump's positions on Muslims, his views on Israel, if you're an Arab or a Muslim voter in Michigan upset with Joe Biden, like you're not going to get a more favorable approach from a Trump White House, right? I mean, they have to know that, don't they?
Yeah, I mean, it is a choice between staying home and voting for Harris, but we have seen some of the polling of the Arab American community in this country that has shown Donald Trump holding a slight lead with it, and that is not the way things usually work. Whether that's ultimately what we'll see in the election, I think is a valid question. The other thing to know here is that Michigan's population, their Arab American population, Middle Eastern, North African descent population is the largest in the country. So this is a more significant factor there than it generally is in other states, but it is not a large percentage of the population by any stretch. I think it's around 1 or 2% of the population. And so I think the bigger threat for Harris is to the extent that her and the Biden administration's record on the war in Gaza might turn off these younger voters who do tend to be more aligned with the Palestinian cause, and then they would stay home, not necessarily vote for Trump, but stay home. And I think that's really probably the bigger impact that we're likely to see in this election, not just in Michigan, but in a lot of these other states.
Elaine, last question to you. We have no idea what's going to happen on Tuesday. Steve Bannon just got out of jail. Conveniently, the timing was almost perfect for his argument that Trump should declare victory no matter what. I mean, where do you think it goes in terms of the willingness to accept the results, what it might be? Because there's so much reporting coming out of your country on what's happening at certification levels, at lower levels of government, that just suggests there's a real toxic stew coming after November 5th, potentially.
Yeah, and I just finished reporting a story about this actually. And I will tell you, everyone is prepared for a scenario in which Donald Trump declares victory no matter what. And there are sort of boiling tensions as the count continues, because remember, so many states in the US are going to take a while to count. And a lot of those states are key states. They're states that will determine the outcome of the election. So we have election officials in Pennsylvania and Wisconsin, Arizona, Georgia, really shoring up their facilities, adding, fencing, barbed wire, armed guards to prevent against possible riots, right? Led by someone declaring victory without an answer being known. And so you have election officials who will bear the brunt of a lot of this tension, threats, potentially violence. So I think we all have our eye on Election Day, of course, making sure that's safe for voters. But yes, the real drama will come in that counting period over the days after.
It's just remarkable. This is where we're at. You know what I mean? To think that this barbed wire and extra security is a remarkable thing. Elaine Godfrey with The Atlantic, Aaron Blake with The Washington Post. Really appreciated the conversation. Thanks for being here tonight.
Thank you.